When sports becomes more than just a game and turns into a matter of life and death, should we not take more measures to ensure that this does not happen anymore? Death in sports is a tragic reality, and it's almost always, without a doubt, a tragic event when someone loses their life. But when it happens to someone who is doing what they love, or merely trying to entertain others, should we not stop and think about whether or not these types of things should be continuing on in 2024? I would argue that we certainly need more discourse that takes into consideration the viability of sports where people are losing their lives. For reference, though, I will not be talking about any of the extreme or fringe sports such as base jumping, rock climbing, or skydiving, as in my own personal humble opinion, I don't see these as sports, but more so as individual and personal activities and hobbies that people engage in. So, for the purpose of this argument, I'm only referring to the major American sports. Now, you may be wondering, of all the major sports, which ones are the most dangerous to play or participate in? And by far, the two most dangerous or deadliest sports that one could play is boxing and football. And I want to preface everything I'm about to say regarding these two sports with the fact that I am a huge, lifelong fan of both of these sports, football and boxing. And unfortunately, I've been a lifelong fan of the Dallas Cowboys, so I apologize for that in advance. And of course, with boxing, that has been one of my favorite sports to watch of all time. I grew up idolizing guys like Mike Tyson, Prince Nassim Hamed, Triple G, Gennady Gennadyevich Golovkin, and of course, the absolute dog, Alfredo Pero Angulo. Amazing boxers. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and let's get into this. Let's start taking a look at some of the tragic history behind both of these sports, boxing and American football. We'll go ahead and get started with the sport of boxing, and in regards to its history, it's almost untraceable, as the sport itself is believed to go back to essentially the beginning of time, if you will. However, one, or at least one of the first believed professional boxing events to take place was all the way back in 688 BC, as this is when professional boxing first appeared as an Olympic sport. In 688 BC, that is extremely old. It's older than what I'm willing to try and figure out how to properly explain on here, but we're talking about the original Olympic Games here, and which of course were all played in Greece at the time. Now, this is obviously way before there's any recorded data regarding matches, injuries, so on and so forth. So we're not even going to bother trying to figure out how many people were severely injured or lost their lives participating in the sport of boxing. For the purpose of this video, we're going to fast forward all the way to the year 1884. The reason this date is significant in the sport of boxing is because this is when the set of rules known as the Queensberry's rules were adopted and accepted as the official rules of the sport of boxing. Additionally, this is when people started keeping track of such tragic events within the sport. And just to be honest, this is really the date that almost every article that I've read points to as the start of data tracking in regards to this specific topic. And of course, the introduction of the Queensberry's rules. So this is just the data and information I was able to acquire. And to be even more honest, boxing is very unique and very interesting in the nature of its setup and design, as it has a lot of outside influences, if you will, that affect the sport. And it is not a typically governed sport in comparison to sports such as football, basketball, or baseball. With football, of course, you have that one entity, the NFL, that controls the sport, regulates the sport, monitors it, and also, of course, does the historical accounting of it and stat tracking. Boxing is nothing like that, as there are multiple organizations and governing bodies, and there are also hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of small local boxing events happening all across the globe. So I say all this just to put into perspective the fact that these numbers that I'm about to explain are alleged and estimated numbers. And these numbers are the ones that have been accounted for, but generally speaking, it is understood that these numbers are likely much greater, as there is not 100% accurate accounting. Conversely, though, we have to keep into perspective that boxing is a very, very much older sport than football, which will be the second sport we'll be discussing here. So they have quite a bit of a head start over any other sport that is still in existence or popular today. So right away, the number that comes up most often in regards to fatalities within the sport of boxing or directly related to the sport of boxing is at this time over 2,000, roughly 2,100 fatalities. That means we can account for 2,100 individuals who have lost their life while participating in this one particular sport. And it is estimated that currently 8 to 10 individuals a year lose their life to the sport of boxing. And looking at the most recent data, really the best collection of information we have is that within the past 20 years, over 100 individuals have lost their life while participating in the sport of boxing, with the most recent being reported in December of 2023. And sadly, that person was only 14 years old. Now, a lot of information I'm getting comes from the Association of Ringside Physicians, in which they release a study about head injury related mortality and combat sports. But the study that they did was from 2000 to 2019, and that information was not released until 2020. So again, that data is not complete and it's not 100% accurate. It's just the best data that we currently have. So please keep that in mind. Now, of course, there are calls every single year to ban the sport of boxing, as it is so brutal, so dangerous, and apparently so deadly. In a 2020 statement, the World Medical Association said that boxing is a qualitatively different sport from other sports because of the injuries it causes, and it should be banned. But what makes boxing so dangerous and so deadly? I think it's pretty obvious, and it should go without saying, that the issue here with the sport of boxing is its reliance on literally punching somebody in the head repeatedly. It is reported that on average, boxers throw 65 punches per round. Now, obviously, you have your very active and talented boxers who throw upwards of 100 to 150 punches per round. Then, of course, on the opposite side of that, you have your slower, less skilled boxers who throw far less punches per round. So it's been averaged out. 65 punches per round for 12 rounds. We have 780 punches thrown per 12-round fight. And of course, 12 rounds is the new maximum that any boxing match can last, which, that's a fairly new rule. And even with this stat, there's still question around when the last 15-round fight actually took place. Oftentimes, there is this fight that Mike Tyson had in 1987 that is referenced as the last official 15-round fight. However, literally just 2 months later, there is another 15-round fight that took place with Evander Holyfield. Even still, there were fights that took place as late as 1990 that were scheduled for 15 rounds. And to make it even more confusing, there is technically one fight for a middleweight belt that was fought in 1997 that was scheduled for 15 rounds. But we are in the age of 12-round fights now, and even then, many of those are reserved for championship title fights, with many of the undercards or lower-level fights being 10 rounds, if not 8 or even 6 rounds. I say all this to summarize the fact that according to the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, 90% of all boxers will suffer a traumatic brain injury in their career. 90%. Additionally, let's take into account the way the sport is played and officiated. There are multiple ways to win a boxing match, from a judge's decision to a technicality to a disqualification, but the most known or the most highlight-worthy way is that of the knockout. The KO, of course, being where one of the combatants succumbs to being punched in the head or body and falls to the ground, unable to stand again. However, once a boxer goes to the ground or gets knocked down, they have 10 seconds to get to their feet and convince the ref that they are good to go and ready to keep fighting. Now, the problem here is that most knockdowns from being punched in the head cause some sort of brain injury. I mean, think about it like this. You're being punched in the head repeatedly, so much so that you can't even stand. You fall to the ground, and then guess what happens? Your head bounces off the ground. Because of this, the person being knocked down most likely has suffered some form of a concussion. So there you are now, laying on the ground with a concussion, and now you have a referee counting to 10. The boxer, within those 10 seconds, stands to his feet, tells the ref he's good to go, and fighting continues. Now this is where it becomes exponentially more dangerous for that boxer that just got knocked down. This is exponentially more dangerous for that boxer because they've already suffered some form of a concussion. If they are to be knocked down again, they will suffer an even more severe concussion that can and typically will lead to severe brain trauma. I'm going to be talking about football here in just a minute. But think about what happens when someone is even suspected of having a concussion in the sport of football. At least this is what happens now. Of course, this wasn't the case a few years ago. Now, if a person is even suspected of having a concussion or gets up and looks wobbly on their feet after a hit, they're immediately removed from the game and they're not allowed to return until they have proven via a medical examination that they did not have a concussion. In boxing, you have just 10 seconds. And it doesn't matter if you have a concussion or not. You just have 10 seconds to get on your feet and put your hands up. Another dangerous aspect of the sport is the ring in which the sport takes place in. We all know what a boxing ring looks like. It's a square of varying sizes, and it's got 4 ropes that run around the outside of it to help contain the boxers from falling out. Let's go ahead and take a look at this image of a standard boxing ring. And what you may notice, based on the diagram, is that oftentimes the boxers in the ring are taller than that top rope. And one of the most dangerous things that can happen to the athletes when fighting is that they suffer whiplash. Now, we all typically know whiplash from when you get into a car accident and your seatbelt catches you, and then your head whips back and forth very quickly and violently. The same thing is happening in the sport of boxing. When a boxer gets pushed up against the ropes and gets punched in the face, their head is whipping back and forth above that top rope, and of course their body is being held there by their opponent. So this is literally just causing their brain to slosh around in their head, bouncing off the front and back of the skull. So all of these factors lead to the high danger associated with the sport of boxing. And maybe the most interesting fact regarding the sport is that the average professional boxer has a life expectancy of only 68 years old. Now compare that to the average life expectancy of an average American, which is 75 to 79 years old, and you can truly see the toll that this sport takes on one's body. And of course, anytime you mention boxing, you have to mention the different variations of it that have become popular over the recent years. Sports such as bare knuckle boxing and the even more popular MMA, or mixed martial arts. However, recent studies have been conducted that show bare knuckle boxing is indeed safer than traditional boxing with gloves. Studies from the Ringside Physicians Report shows that only about 1.5% of all bare knuckle boxers suffered from symptoms of a concussion post-fight, whereas 6 to 12% of professional boxers had symptoms of concussions post-fight. And in regards to MMA, there have been very few deaths, but you must keep in mind that MMA has been around as a sport far less than that of boxing. The number that we have is 17 fighters have lost their life while competing in mixed martial arts. And I have to point out that none of those have been in the popular promotion, the UFC. Additionally, MMA is safer by the design of it. Unlike professional boxing, where you wear heavily padded gloves, both MMA and bare knuckle boxing either don't wear gloves, obviously, or have a very lightly padded gloves. This allows the participants to not punch nearly as hard or as often as they do in professional boxing, thus causing less concussions. Additionally, the ring of an MMA fight is essentially a cage, thus eliminating the whiplash effect. The cage of an MMA ring extends above the fighters' bodies and heads. When trapped in the corner of a cage, that fighter's body, and more importantly their head, is supported by that cage, and their head can't violently jostle back and forth. So the question is, what's greater, the risk or the reward in boxing? To help determine this, you obviously have to look at the average career length of a professional boxer as well as their average income. Looking at just the career length of a professional boxer, it does vary from weight class to weight class, but typically we have a range anywhere from 11 to 20 years, again, depending on their weight class. Now, in regards to what a professional boxer earns in their career, obviously you're going to have your superstars who earn hundreds of millions of dollars throughout their career. But on the flip side of that, you're going to have your professional boxers who are making as little as $20,000 a year in their career. But on average, the best number that I could find is $60,000. That is the expected average salary per year for a professional boxer, with only the top 1% of all professional boxers earning more than $1 million per year, and the lowest 10% of all professional boxers earning $20,000 a year. So, do you have the skill and the will to become one of those top 1% of professional boxers who make that $1 million plus per year? That is what one must consider when weighing out the risks versus the rewards of professional boxing. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about some good old-fashioned American football. Now, the numbers for American football are going to be a lot more straightforward, as there is an annual report put out every single year, albeit a year late, but it still lists out every single fatality due to playing the sport of football. For historical reference, and for the historians out there, the first American football game was not professional. It was, in fact, a college football game. On November 6th, 1869, Rutgers and Princeton played the very first American football game. Now, the first professional American football game is credited to have taken place, according to the National Football Hall of Fame, on November 12, 1892, between the Allegheny Athletic Association and the Pittsburgh Athletic Club. Now, we just finished talking about boxing with the risks versus the rewards of the sport. But instead, for football, let's start with the risks versus the rewards of the sport. To start, the average career length of a professional football player is only 3.3 years. That's how long someone will play in the NFL. Now, obviously, there are other professional football leagues out there outside of the NFL. Most notably, we have the new United Football League, which is a combination of the United States Football League and the XFL, which will begin this spring. But there's also leagues out there in other countries, from Mexico to Japan. But 3.3 years is the number that always gets thrown out there for the average career length of a professional football player. Now, in regard to the average salary of an NFL player, they make, on average, $2 million a year, with a minimum salary for a first-year rookie of $435,000 a year. And of course, you have your top-tier players who are earning in excess of $50 million a year at this point. But again, on average, you can expect to make $2 million a year as an NFL player. Again, looking at the professional boxer, where the average career length is much higher at almost 20 years, but the average salary is much lower at almost $60,000 a year. Which one is better? But of course, you also have to take into account the fact that there are roughly 20,000 professional boxers out there, whereas the NFL only has roughly 2,000 professional players. So the odds of becoming a professional boxer are much greater. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the numbers regarding the severity of danger that one takes on when playing the sport of football. Within the sport of football, it wasn't until the year 1931 that official data was tracked on traumatic injuries within the sport, but at all levels. So we're talking about professional leagues here, college football, high school, middle school, on down to the youth programs. And the most recent data that we have is from the year 2022, as the 2023 data has yet to be released. In all, from the year 1931 to 2022, there's been 1,926 individuals who lost their lives due to participating in the sport of football. Of those, 303 are from youth football, such as Pop Warner or Pee Wee football. 1,280 were from middle school or high school football. Only 236 were from college football, leaving 107 from professional football. Now, there are two main reasons for these numbers: traumatic injury, almost always traumatic brain injury, and the other being typically heat exhaustion or some other form of heat-related illness. All right, so we've already talked about the average career length of a football player and their average salary, but what we haven't mentioned yet is the average life expectancy of a professional football player. Remember, the average life expectancy of a professional boxer is 68. And the average life expectancy of the average American ranges from 75 to 79 years. Well, as a professional football player, your average life expectancy is only 59 to 60 years old. Now let that sink in. 59 to 60 years old. For even more perspective, the sport with the highest life expectancy is tennis at the age of 80. So if you play tennis, you're going to outlive the average American. Now, why is this? Why does playing the sport of football take such a toll on one's life expectancy? Obviously, because of the way the sport is played. Within the sport, you're taking on multiple high-impact collisions throughout the duration of that game. Many of us have probably heard at some time someone explaining that tackling in football is similar to experiencing a head-on car crash. Now imagine getting into multiple head-on car crashes within a single hour. But what is the actual reality behind in-game collisions? For reference, the average NFL lineman weighs 300 pounds and can now run a 40-yard dash under 5 seconds. So a lineman of that size that can run that fast has the ability to exert a force of 1,700 pounds. That is the equivalent of you driving your car headfirst into a brick wall at 18 to 20 miles an hour. Now do that multiple times within a single hour, and that is what playing in the NFL will do to your body. But hold on, you probably noticed that based on the numbers that we just looked at, that middle and high school football is far more dangerous than professional football. And obviously, in middle and high school football, we don't have a bunch of 300-pound linemen sprinting around the field. So what makes middle and high school football so dangerous is the condition in which they play and practice the sport. The majority of tragedies experienced at that level is due to heat stroke or some other form of heat-related fatality. This doesn't happen at the professional level because most NFL teams have indoor practice facilities, and then most NFL stadiums are typically domes or covered stadiums protected from the sun. Middle and high school football fields and stadiums are exactly that. Fields outside. Additionally, the NFL has very strict rules about how long and how often their players can practice. Those same rules are non-existent at many of the middle and high school programs, and many of the coaches at that level are the ones who determine that. Combine that with the fact that practice for upcoming seasons typically take place in the spring or summer during the hottest days, and seasons typically start late summer, and now you have a recipe for disaster. I think at this point, it's obvious that we should have more discourse around the risks versus the rewards when determining whether or not we should participate in physically taxing sports such as football and boxing. What do you think? Is boxing too brutal? Is football too brutal? Should we place more emphasis on sports that have high life expectancies like tennis, swimming, soccer, cycling, badminton? You tell me.